My name is Marcus Clayton. I'm a senior at the Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania, Mansfield campus. My major is in social work and I minor in political science. Today I want to talk about the accountability for war crimes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict while highlighting the role of international arms transfer. As accountability for war crimes and international arms transfers are crucial in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because these two issues are deeply interconnected. Without accountability, parties involved in the conflict may continue to commit grave violations of international humanitarian law, such as targeting civilians or using excessive force. International arms transfers, in turn, are often fueling these actions by providing the tools necessary for these violations to occur. I'd like to take a brief moment just to see the sheer destruction in this photograph of which once stood the Yasin Mosque in Gaza. The image from CNN shows the mosque after it was bombed following a deadly Hamas attack. The airstrikes have led to widespread destruction across Gaza, including densely populated areas such as this and surrounding areas like the Shati refugee camp. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, these strikes have resulted in a large number of civilian casualties, including children. While Israel maintains that its military operations are targeting Hamas, the reality is that Gaza's population density makes it nearly impossible to avoid civilian harm. As it shows, the arms provided to both sides of the conflict can fuel violence that disproportionately affects innocent civilians, underscoring the need for tighter controls on arms transfers and greater accountability for the harm caused. Overview of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, which has deep historical roots that date back over a century. The origins can be traced to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Jewish migration to Palestine increased, driven by the rise of Zionism and the Jewish desire for a homeland in response to centuries of persecution in Europe. At the time, Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire and its population was predominantly Arab. Jewish migration intensified, particularly after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which the British government expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, leading to tensions between Jewish immigrants and Arab populations. For over 100 years, the conflict has revolved around competing national identities, territorial disputes, and the rights of refugees, with no lasting solution in sight. The Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, the expansion of Israeli settlements, and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination have fueled cycles of violence and deepened divisions, making it one of the most protracted and difficult conflicts in modern history. Where does international arms transfers fit into this conflict between Israel and Palestine? Well, first, what are international arms transfers? International arms transfers refer to the sale, supply, or transfer of military equipment, weapons, and related technologies from one country to another. These transfers can include conventional arms such as tanks, aircraft, missiles, and firearms, as well as the training and support services that accompany these systems. Now, taking a closer look, international arms transfers have surged in recent years, driven by the conflicts such as the war in Ukraine and the rising tensions in the Middle East. In 2023, the United States saw a record nearly $81 billion in arms transfer, largely attributed to its effort to counter Russia's influence in Europe and bolster allies like Ukraine and Israel. The U.S. plays a critical role in arms transfers to Israel, where military aid and weapons sales have been accelerated in response to the conflict with Hamas. Some of these arms transfers were approved in previous years, but the urgent need for military supplies after Hamas's attack on October 7th led to the Biden administration circumventing Congress to make emergency sales worth over $250 million. While the U.S. justifies these transfers as necessary for defense, critics argue that continuing to supply arms to Israel, especially considering the high civilian death toll in Gaza, contradicts U.S. laws like the Leahy Law, which is meant to limit aid to countries involved in human rights violations. Nevertheless, arms sales to Israel are expected to continue, potentially driving further regional tensions and militarization in the coming years. As we continue to explore the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a critical question arises. Does Israel's military activity in Gaza amount to war crimes under international law? To answer this, we first need to understand what constitutes a war crime. War crimes are defined as serious violations of international humanitarian law committed during an armed conflict. They encompass a large range of unlawful acts, particularly those that inflict suffering on civilians or disproportionately destructive. A key example of this is the use of white phosphorus over Gaza City, which both inflicted severe suffering on civilians and demonstrated a disproportionate use of force. Although white phosphorus has specific military uses, its deployment in densely populated areas like Gaza raises significant legal concerns. Under Protocol 3 of the 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the use of incendiary weapons, including white phosphorus, is heavily restricted, particularly in civilian areas. While not always classified strictly as an incendiary weapon, its use in such contexts violates international law when it causes harm to civilian or civilian infrastructure. Building on the potential war crimes we just discussed, it's important to consider the role that international arms transfers play in this conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has witnessed widespread use of military force, often in densely populated civilian areas, which has led to numerous allegations of war crimes. International organizations and human rights bodies have documented instances of indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate use of force against civilians. A significant factor fueling this violence is the continuous transfer of arms. Countries like the United States, along with European arms manufacturers, have supplied Israel with advanced weaponry, much of which has been used in operations in Gaza. Tragically, these operations have resulted in the deaths and injuries of many civilians, including women and children. Under international humanitarian law, particularly the Geneva Conventions, there are strict prohibitions against the use of weapons that cannot distinguish between combatants and civilians or that cause unnecessary suffering. Yet, despite these legal safeguards, the continued flow of arms to Israel during its military operation raises serious concerns about violations of these fundamental legal principles. UN experts and the Human Rights Council have made urgent calls to halt arms transfers to Israel, arguing that these sales not only escalate the conflict, but also risk complicity in war crimes and even potential genocide due to this high civilian death toll. Countries supplying weapons have a responsibility to ensure they are not used in ways that violate international humanitarian law, and failing to do so could result in violations of state obligations under international law. Arms manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Boeing also have a duty to conduct human rights due diligence, ensuring that their weapons are not contributing to unlawful actions. If they fail to address these concerns, they risk becoming complicit in war crimes. Likewise, financial institutions investing in these companies face increasing pressure to divest, as their support could link them to human rights abuses, leading them to legal and reputational risk. In conclusion, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict highlights the critical need for accountability in war crimes and stricter controls over international arms transfers. The devastation seen in Gaza and other civilian areas due to military operation illustrates the profound humanitarian toll that arises when arms are supplied without adequate oversight. These transfers, particularly from nations like the United States and major arms manufacturers, fuel a cycle of violence that disproportionately harms civilians and raises serious concerns under international humanitarian law. As we've discussed, treaties such as the Geneva Conventions exist to protect civilians during armed conflict, yet the continued flow of arms into the region threatens to undermine these principles. The complicity of arms manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and the financial institutions backing them cannot be ignored. These companies and their investors must be held accountable to ensure their products are not used in ways that violate international law or contribute to human suffering. The United Nations and the Human Rights Council have called for urgent action, including halting arms transfers to Israel and enforcing an embargo to prevent further civilian casualties. However, real change will require global leaders, corporations, and states to prioritize human rights and legal accountability over profits and political alliances. Only through tightened regulations on arms transfers and greater accountability can we hope to mitigate the catastrophic humanitarian impact of this conflict and move towards a future where the rights and lives of civilians are protected. Ultimately, the international community must demand both legal consequences and moral leadership to break this cycle of violence. By ensuring the accountability and regulating arms transfers, we take a necessary step towards fostering peace and upholding the fundamental principles of international law.